Hello there, welcome to the Saroy channel, wherever you are in the world, and to part 3 of our story tonight, which is getting very exciting because we know 2 boys in the woods of a cemetery saw something in those woods, and we're about to find out what that is. And if you haven't heard the first and second part, don't forget to click on the description. So let's continue with part 3 of our story tonight. So what on earth did they see? Asked Mrs. Sanderson, cupping her mouth in excitement and reaching out for yet more wine. Mildred took in a deep breath to steady herself. She began to tweak the table napkin nervously in her hands. My brother and Christopher were stealthily hiding behind a large tree trunk that bordered a clearing in the woods. They saw 2 shadowy, ambiguous silhouettes that were so gargantuan in size. My brother could not fathom what they were seeing. At first they were so bewildered, they literally had to rub their eyes, like you do when you think you're not seeing right. Ostensibly, my brother's cocky, assertive confidence fled from him like a frightened dog. His heart began to thunder violently in his chest. His whole body rattled under the vibration. He told me his breath literally froze in his mouth, and that Christopher's face had grown as white as a sheet. His friend whispered to him, "What the hell are those things? What the hell?" My brother and his friend were seeing 2 huge creatures, at about 9 foot tall and about 800 pounds, built like 2 powerful concrete buildings. They were incredibly robust, very strong. They looked like men with bullet-shaped heads, human faces, and overlong arms, but covered in long flowing hair that smelt of wood smoke and moss intermingled with human sweat. It was not an unpleasant smell. Both were considerably different in appearance, one with hair as dark as midnight, the other with hair as white as a snowflake. The one that had white hair had some scratches all over his face that suggested he'd been involved in a multitude of scraps, and even from a distance he had a mean look about him. His nostrils flared, his demeanour was savage. My brother believed the white creature had murderous intent, as if he was desirous to kill the black one. His behaviour was manic, almost as if he was unhinged. My brother told Christopher he was almost 100% certain that these 2 creatures they were seeing were Bigfoots. The dark Bigfoot was very human-looking, the white one a lot more primitive. The Bigfoots were lunging at each other, pounding each other with their fists. It was a real brawl, and the white Bigfoot was screaming as if he was being murdered every time the black Bigfoot dealt him a blow. They were formidable, screeching furiously at each other. They were definitely both male, as the testosterone in the air was palpable. They began shouting at each other like humans do. They spoke in a strange language. They were bickering about something like 2 men arguing about a car parking spot at the mall, and who saw it first, although it was much more serious than that. Both these hairy men were sorely aggrieved about something, and my brother sensed there was something wrong with the white Bigfoot. He was really so wacko. Well, that's the way he put it anyway. All of a sudden, my brother said the fighting stopped. Everything became eerily quiet. Even the crickets and frogs became mute. Both the Bigfoots turned around to look in the direction of where my brother and his friend were hiding, behind that tree trunk. They knew at once that something was there, and began walking together side by side, as if they'd forgotten about their spat. They were now investigating the thing that had caught their undivided attention, which in this case was my brother and his friend. My brother was so terrified, as these Bigfoots were no ghosts. He said a ghost he could just about deal with, even an angry one, but not these 2 powerful, formidable Bigfoot that made him and his friend feel as tiny and fragile as 2 paper boats. The 2 boys tried to creep away clandestinely, running from their hiding spot, but were genuinely frozen, unable to receive that quintessential adrenaline spike that they desperately needed to run away. It was the white Bigfoot that pulled my brother out of his hiding spot. He began screaming at my brother, dangling my brother from a powerful hand, as if playing with a puppet on a string. The creature's eyes bored into my brother's, and he was incandescent with rage. Christopher just knew my brother was dead, and sensing his own danger, he suddenly began running away, screaming at the top of his lungs. But my brother had been caught, and it was too late for him. Christopher was distraught as he ran away, his legs feeling like large concrete blocks beneath him. He was terrified that the dark Bigfoot would be giving him chase, but he realized he was not being followed. Christopher was now certain he'd never see my brother again, as the formidable white Bigfoot had been murderous. My brother said he waited for the fateful blow from the white Bigfoot to end his life. He closed his eyes tightly, accepting his fate, but the blow never came. He opened his eyes to see the black hairy Bigfoot wrestling the white Bigfoot, pinning him down to the ground so hard, straddling him, so that the white Bigfoot released my brother from his fearsome hold. The black hairy man screamed something at my brother. He heard the words bolting into his head. "Go, otherwise he'll kill you. He's a bad man, very bad. Go." My brother didn't need any encouragement. He quickly hightailed it through the grove, and even overtook Christopher, who was running away from the scene, very surprised to see my brother was all right. They were huffing and puffing and breathing furiously. Both boys did not speak about the event for years. It traumatized them so greatly. But my brother knows now that they encountered two Bigfoot for sure, and that the black one had saved his life, telling him to go. He had a lucky escape. It would seem the white Bigfoot that was covered in scratches was probably a bit of a bully. Well, that's what my brother deduced anyway. "Your brother encountered a Bigfoot!" gasped Mrs. Sanderson. "Are those cryptid creatures even real? I thought they were legendary. But your story is telling me otherwise. You can't make a story like this up." "This story is not made up," said Mildrew. "My brother and I were very close growing up. He told me the story in the strictest of confidence. He had hoped to encounter a ghost. Instead, he encountered two male Bigfoots caught up in a brawl. One who was clearly kind and considerate, the other rather unhinged. My brother said they were exactly like human beings. So I guess you get good Bigfoots and bad ones. He said the black one had the most beautiful eyes he'd ever seen, but the white one was malevolent and badly scratched up. My brother suspected he was a big troublemaker, always stirring up problems. I suspect the black Bigfoot was trying to put him in his place, which was why they were fighting. But the black Bigfoot had warned him that the white Bigfoot was bad, so I guess it was true." "That's an extraordinary story," said Mrs. Pearson. "We have enough exciting stories between us to write our own mystery novel, it would seem. Oh, my word, that's my phone ringing," as the cell phone beside her plate began to tingle. "Bless my cotton socks! Talk of the devil! It's my daughter Molly, the one who was visited by the little girl in the bloody nightgown when she was 16 years old. Maybe she's found the house she's looking for. Do you mind dreadfully if I take it? I'll put it on speakerphone so you can all hear her. I hope it's good news, I really do. She's been house hunting for an age and is becoming increasingly discouraged, but still hasn't found what she's looking for. She's one of those people that has a very particular taste in everything. She's seen so many houses of late that look much the same and hasn't been interested in any of them. I wish she wasn't so particular." "Hello, sweetheart. How's everything going?" Mrs. Pearson asked her daughter, as all her friends listened in to the call. "I'm hosting one of my bird club lunches, dear. Everyone's listening to you. I hope you don't mind." "Hello, Molly," came the voices of Mrs. Pearson's friends. "Hello, everyone. I hope you're having a great lunch and that my mum isn't ploughing you with way too much alcohol. I know what she's like. She has a reputation for being too generous, I'm afraid." "Believe me, dear, we know. We're watching our glasses," said Mrs. Sanderson. "We know what your mother's like. She's cooked us a very delicious lunch, ploughing us with so much alcohol." "Why doesn't that surprise me?" laughed Molly. "It's impossible to watch calories in my mother's household. She overfeeds everyone. You're not going to believe it, but I've found the most perfect house. I can't believe it myself. The moment I saw it, I knew it was the one." "Oh, darling, I'm so thrilled to hear that. About time, too. It sounds wonderful. Tell us about it," said Mrs. Pearson, her face looking heartily relieved, as her daughter's house hunting had worn her to a frazzle. "It's not in town. It's in the countryside with the houses not too far apart. I mean, my neighbour's fence is on the other side and it's close to me. But behind the house you see the trees and the shimmering lake. We're very close to an area of natural forest near Gooseberry State Park, which is along the Lake Superior shoreline, with the most spectacular views. Oh, Mum, you need to see this place. It's to die for. Marcus is not over enamoured with it, of course. He was hoping for something a lot more modern. But you know me. I like houses with a bit of history. I believe this one was built in the 1950s. It oozes charm. It's been modernised a little bit. I like houses that have mellowed from being lived in a little. I think Marcus would prefer something completely new. Keep your fingers crossed, Mum, that I get this place." "What do you like about the place, Molly?" asked Mrs. Sanderson curiously. "Good question. I know it sounds strange, but I think when I saw the house for the first time, I had the feeling as if I was coming home. I've been house hunting for ages, you see, and even as we drove down the drive, everything felt absolutely right. It was like a déjà vu experience, if you know what I mean." "I do know what you mean, young lady," said Mrs. Sanderson. "It sounds as if you found for yourself a house that is obviously meant to be." "Thanks, Mrs. Sanderson. I appreciate that. I hope you're right, but I've got a good feeling about this. I really have." Molly's account. "My husband Donny was not best pleased with me. I think he thought I'd have found the right house for the two of us to live in by now. He had given me carte blanche to choose any house I desired for the two of us to live in. I know he was beginning to feel worn down by the property hunting that was eating away at him like a worm inside an apple. I think he was wondering why I was seemingly impossible to please. I'd never been a high-maintenance sort of woman, demanding very much from my husband, but house hunting had become like a thorn in our sides. Every time he was shown around a property, it was never right for me, even if on the surface it looked so perfect. To be fair, Donny would have been happy to live in the vast majority of houses we had overseen. Don't get me wrong, some of them were very pleasing indeed, but a cheeky little voice whispered in the back of my head, "This is not the right house for you," and I trusted my instincts at once. I could see the estate agent, Mrs. Sollyman, whom had been showing me around a number of houses, was almost losing patience with me, sensing that I was the stumbling block that was preventing the advent of an easy sale for her. She was trying to hide her feelings well for fear that a sale might slip through her fingers, like butter, if she offended me in any way. I'm a big girl, and I'm not going to allow being offended by someone to put me off buying a place if it's the right property for me. But I didn't tell her that, of course. When we first met Mrs. Sollyman, she had a smile on her face so wide, I'm actually surprised her jaws did not crack from the effort, or she didn't get fatigue from wearing a smile for the entire day like that, rather reminding me of women in the 1800s who wore painfully tight corsets in order to keep their waists as tiny as possible. Ostensibly, after showing us countless houses, the smile on her face faded as fast as a dying flower in a vase. Her shoulders slumped, and her straightened deportment seemed to wither, so she resembled a weeping willow tree, rather than a tall, proud pine tree. "I've shown you around a number of properties, around the Lake Superior area," she said to me, with a wariness to her voice that made her sound as if she'd run the Boston Marathon. "Some of those houses I've shown you are in remarkably good condition, highly sought-after lakefront views. But why is it you don't like any of them? What am I not getting? If you explained what you're looking for, Mrs. Pottimer, then maybe we can work together on the same page." "That's it," I said. "I don't know exactly what I'm looking for, but I will when I see it." The estate agent, Mrs. Sollyman's eyes rounded, as if she couldn't quite believe the words that had come out of my mouth. "You won't know until you see it. That's the first time I've heard that," she said, with a whisper of sarcasm in her voice. "I've been an estate agent for over 20 years, Mrs. Potterman. I began working as an agent when I was 25 years old, you know. And no one has ever said something like that to me before. I could tell the agent probably thought I was the most difficult customer she'd ever had the pleasure to meet. And frankly, I didn't really care. It was my husband who swept in with the apologies on my behalf, in order to redeem my character in some way. My wife has a very particular property in mind, I think. I've been trying to tell her that buying real estate is not as straightforward as she thought it was. I think she has an image in her mind that she won't relinquish. I do agree with you, Mrs. Solomon. Some of the properties you have shown us are indeed flawless and spectacular in every regard. But as you can appreciate, I have to keep my wife happy. If she doesn't want the place, then I can't argue with her on that one. But I assure you, she is not intending to be difficult." The estate agent gave him a sympathetic "you poor thing" kind of look. You've got your hands full with such a difficult wife to please. In truth, I'm not a difficult person, even though I certainly gave off that impression to Mrs. Solomon. It is so easy to misinterpret someone's character, based on the way they might be behaving at the time. But Mrs. Solomon had me all wrong, even though I suspect she had pigeonholed me on her short list of her least favourite customers. And I cannot fault her for that. I was being picky, but I couldn't help myself. I'm sure Mrs. Solomon clandestinely rather fancied herself as an exemplary salesperson. Then I came along to set the cat among the pigeons, to show her unequivocally that her sales techniques had not been perfected yet, as she had not successfully persuaded me to love any of the properties she had shown me. I felt most of the houses were rather nondescript, lacking in personality. The estate agent let out a wary sigh, as if spending time in our company had exhausted her, and I suspect it most certainly had. Mrs. Solomon looked older than her 45 years, but I had a profound sense her love for the job had waned in recent years, and perhaps when she was in her 20s she had been hugely ambitious, but her job had flatlined, and she went through the daily drudgery of dealing with customers, a whole lot more amenable than me, I suspect, but it was tough going all the same, as dealing with people is never easy, as any restaurant manager would likely tell you. And if I was in her shoes, I'd not take much pleasure in dealing with the likes of me. She let out a sigh and said, "Well then, I guess we're done for the day. There's nothing left to show you apart from the Thornton house, but that won't suit you." She reached out to shake my husband's hand, to bid him farewell, and retracted a little when she reluctantly took my hand in hers. Suffice to say, her cursory remarks about the Thornton house not being my kind of thing got my immediate attention. I knew no one should ever presume to know what somebody else likes or dislikes, and this estate agent had shown us around properties that did not tick any of my boxes. So the fact that she was dismissing the Thornton property out of hand made me feel all the more determined to see the place. I could see the relief on Donny's face, glad to finally call it a day. But I was not in such a hurry to close the curtain on our house hunting. Not just yet. "Sorry, what is this property you're talking about?" I asked. "Oh, the Thornton house. It won't be your kind of thing, I'm afraid," said Mrs. Solomon. She waved her perfectly manicured hand dismissively in the air. "You will hate the place. It's really not worth your time or energy to even go and see it. It's got beautiful views, many of them blocked out by a plethora of trees that will require cutting to enjoy those views again. The place is old, if you know what I mean. Caught up in a bit of a 1950s time warp." "Well, what exactly is wrong with it?" I asked gingerly. "Well, as I said, it's an old 1950s house. It's been modernised on the lower floors, but there are so many more desirable properties out there on the marketplace, so much superior to this one. This is like a poor cousin compared to some of the illustrious properties out there on the marketplace. And with your generous budget, you can afford to be rather picky. Yes, it's been modernised a bit, but it does feel old. It would be like purchasing an old cart horse that hobbles around the farmyard, compared to a brand new stallion in the prime of its life, if you know what I mean." I didn't know what she meant at all. Besides, I was always fond of cart horses. Those horses had oodles of character. "Look," I said, I know you think I've been messing you around, Mrs. Solomon, and I so apologize for that. But imagine if this house that you don't want to show us around is the one I'm actually looking for. Then you could lose a sale, and I'm sure you don't want that." My words were like throwing icy cold water over her face, and the word sale was like saying walkies to a dog. So I got Mrs. Solomon's undivided attention. "With the greatest of respect, Mrs. Pottermore, I think the house you want exists in your own head, and not in real life. I don't mean to be rude, but if it makes you feel very happy, I would be delighted to take you around the Thornton property. But I do have to warn you, I think you're going to be bitterly disappointed. Old houses built in the 50s, well, they are inferior to houses that are built now, in my humble opinion. Of course, you can decide that for yourself when you see the Thornton property. You can follow me in my BMW. I'll take you there right now." "Why is it that all estate agents appear to have silver BMWs?" Donnie asked me, with amusement in his voice, as we followed Mrs. Solomon, the estate agent, in my husband's robust Range Rover, to the Thornton property. Her silver BMW teetered down the road, like a reluctant woman on high heels, as this road was not asphalted or smooth, but a bumpy dirt road filled with potholes that had become like miniature ponds, filled to the brim with water from the recent rainfall. Mrs. Solomon probably didn't like getting her silver BMW dirty, despite the fact she did her damnedest to avoid getting it sprayed with muddy splatters, but to no avail. The panels of her perfect shiny car were now dappled with mud, so her silver BMW did not look quite so silver any more. "I hope to God, sweetheart, that you like this place we're going to see now," said Donnie gingerly. "Mrs. Solomon will have got her silver BMW messed up, for nothing on your account, if it's not to your liking, that is, and that kind of makes me feel very bad for her. When she gets home after an exhausting day showing us around various properties, she'll have to wash her car, thanks to us." I made an insouciant face. "It's tough," I said, "but it's her job to handle difficult clients like us and to go around and around the mulberry bush showing people properties. Isn't that what she's supposed to do? No one's forcing her to be an estate agent, are they?" "Now you're not being fair, nor are you being kind," said Donnie. "Some people do the jobs they do for the money, as I do mine. I'm one of the fortunate ones because I enjoy what I do. But others aren't quite so lucky. I feel sorry for Mrs. Solomon. She looks weathered, tired from her job, and you're not making life for her any more easy. I'm not being unkind, sweetheart, but I feel as if we're going around and around in circles, finding a house for ourselves. Mrs. Solomon is absolutely right. We have seen some incredible properties that she has patiently taken us around, yet none of them are good enough for you. And it's driving me potty, sweetheart. You're going to have to make your mind up sooner or later. Let's just say looking at houses is now wearing me to a frazzle. I'm completely exhausted by this venture." "I'm so sorry, Donnie, but I know the house I'm looking for is out there. I feel it in my bones. I really do." It was through a very narrow injection between these tall, lofty evergreen trees with needled boughs that we drove down a slender dirt road, which opened out into a wide clearing, and that was when I saw the house, and in that moment I felt I'd come home. "This is the house!" I told my husband excitedly. "This is the house I've been looking for! I feel as if I'd come home, Donnie! Oh my goodness, we found it, Donnie! I'm so excited!" I said, unable to control my enthusiasm. My husband looked astounded. "How can you possibly say this is the house, sweetheart? You haven't even been inside it yet." "I can't explain it," I told him. "It feels like home. I feel as if the house is welcoming us. Don't you feel it too?" "I feel nothing of the sort," said my husband ruefully. "It's just bricks and mortar as far as I'm concerned. That is how I see it." My husband parked his car in the driveway, behind Mrs. Solomon's BMW. The woman climbed out of the driver's side seat, wearing an expression of sorrowful regret on her face, that she tried her best to eradicate. She managed a watery smile as she approached us rather ruefully, stumbling awkwardly over the muddy terrain in her low-heeled court shoes that had now been baptized with mud. "It's a bit messy over here, I'm afraid. It's all the rain they've had of late. This is the house," she said with an open hand gesture. "If you look through those trees, you can see the beginning of the view of the lake and the sandy beach. Now, if you get the trees chopped down, you will maximize the benefits of that lakefront view, which I'm sure will be most spectacular," she said, sounding as enthusiastic as a dog that has been presented with a bowl of lettuce leaves for dinner. "If you look to your left, you see a wood grove over there that belongs to the property. Eventually it meets another back dirt country road where the property ends. It's a nice parcel of land. Further to your right is a traditional wooden fence, and that is where your immediate neighbour resides. I gather she's an old lady called Mrs. Paula Erickson. She's lived in the house next door to yours that was initially built in the 1950s. The two houses were designed by the same architect, built by the same contractor at the time, and they're pretty similar, but at the same time different, as in recent years the last owners of the Thornton property renovated the house ever so slightly, so some of the downstairs interior rooms are more open plan. But the place still requires some work, especially in the upstairs bedrooms that have been somewhat neglected over the years, and need a touch of TLC, so to speak." For a second, Mrs. Solomon studied my face rather curiously, startled to see that I was smiling as brightly as a Cheshire cat. She looked taken aback. Until now she'd seen me looking rather tight-lipped and unresponsive to anything she'd shown me before, but now I looked like a satisfied kid at the diner that had been presented with a delicious chocolate sundae. "Mrs. Pottimer, do you like this place?" she asked, drawing in a deep breath, as if she couldn't believe this was a possibility. I could almost hear her heart flapping excitedly in her chest, as she anticipated a sale with a handsome commission cheque floating towards her and dropping into her hands like a white feather on the wind. "She seems to be quite taken by it," my husband interjected on my behalf, "even though we haven't seen the place inside yet." "Well, I'm so pleased to hear that, Mrs. Pottimer. I'm so glad we found something to your liking. It's a very lovely property. I'll have to show you the inside first. I like it because I feel as if I'm coming home. We both want to put an offer on it, don't we, Donny?" Mrs. Solomon raised her hand. "Slow down, Mrs. Pottimer. You need to see the place first before you can put an offer in to the owners. I don't want to be accused of not showing you the house fully. There are things I need to point out to you. Some of the floors are a little creaky because of the age of the property, and the upstairs rooms are going to need a makeover." "I don't care about that. I want the house," I told her. As Mrs. Solomon left me and my husband to explore the property, I could hear her on the phone to one of the estate agents at the offices, and unbeknown to her, I heard every word of her conversation, which made me smile. The woman was clearly in shock. "You're not going to believe it, Andrew. That nauseating woman I was telling you about, Mrs. Pottimer, who turned down some amazing properties. She loves the old Thornton house. Can you believe it? I was in total shock. She says she wants to put an offer down for the place. It feels like it's in the middle of nowhere. The house needs so much work, but she is so committed to buying it." It was true. I was. There was no doubt about it. So the estate agent had an offer on the table to present to the owners at the end of the day, and it was cordially accepted. Before we moved into the Thornton house, Donny organised for some of the trees blocking the views of the lake to be taken down. The results were absolutely phenomenal. The views over the water were more spectacular and prepossessing than many of the houses we had visited, and the light that had previously been blocked out from the trees flooded the house with a pretty luminescence. Even Donny was pained to admit that I had chosen wisely and seen the great potential of a house that had very good bones, and was probably better constructed than some of the houses you buy today, that sometimes compromise on using the highest quality building materials to cut down their costs. It must have been on the third day that we moved into our house that I saw our next-door neighbour, in her large floppy sun hat, tending to her vegetable bed. I waved at her, and she hurriedly came over to me, with a warm smile on her face, and I knew at once that I liked her, which was a relief, as when you buy a house, you cannot always choose your next-door neighbours. It would seem me and Donnie got very lucky, as Paula Erickson was an endearing old woman that I naturally warmed to at once. It was very good to know that we had one close next-door neighbour. I always found that oddly reassuring. Someone you can pop over to have a chat, or to borrow a cup of sugar if needs must. "Hello, my dear. You must be our new next-door neighbour. I was wondering who'd move into the Thornton place. My name is Paula Erickson. Who might you be?" "My name is Molly Pottimer. My husband's name is Donnie. It's the two of us that have moved into the house at the moment. But in the future we're hoping to have children." "How lovely! You're both so terribly young, with your whole life ahead of you. It'll be nice to have children on that property again. The most recent owners were an old retired couple, but the time before that was a young family with children. But that was a long time ago. So the children are probably twice your age by now. Doesn't time fly? It reminds me of how dreadfully old I'm becoming. I understand from the estate agent, Mrs. Sollyman, that you've lived in the house since it was first constructed." "That's right, my dear. I was a teenager. I was about 14 years old when I was living in this house that my father bought. It was constructed on this large plot of land, designed by an excellent architect, I believe, in the 1950s. So yes, I've lived here for a rather long time, because my father left it to me in his will. I knew the original owners, the Thorntons. They had 4 kids, 2 boys and 2 girls. But it's so tragic what happened to little Jackie Thornton. But dare I say the estate agent must have told you all about that, I'm most sure." "About what?" I asked, perturbed. "Oh, you don't know," said Mrs. Erickson. "Well, maybe the estate agent didn't feel it necessary to tell you about it, because it happened outside the property an awfully long time ago. It's probably not relevant anymore." "What happened outside the property?" I asked. "I don't think I should tell you, dear, because you might find it rather distressing." "Please tell me. I'd really like to know, Mrs. Erickson." "Very well, then. Mrs. Thornton accidentally ran over her little child, Jackie, who was about 7 years old at the time. Wee little thing she was. Mrs. Thornton had her children terribly young. She was about a year older than I was. Her first baby she had at 15, I think. Then Jackie came along when she was 21 years old. She wasn't really mature enough to be a mother, you know. It was overwhelming for the poor thing. It was 1973, I believe, when the tragedy happened. She was leaving the property for some bizarre reason in the very early hours of the morning. It was about 2-something, I believe. I think her daughter just ran out in her white nightdress in front of the car to retrieve her teddy bear. The girl was killed instantaneously. Mrs. Thornton ran her over. It was a tragedy. I don't think the Thorntons recovered from what happened. I ran out of the house because I heard the commotion. I heard the screams. That poor little girl. Blood all over her white nightdress. It was too terrible for words. They sold the house at once, you know. They still live around the Lake Superior area, about 10 minutes away from here. I just don't think they could continue to live in the property where a tragedy like that had occurred. Mr. Thornton tragically died a while back from emphysema, you know. But I still see Mrs. Thornton around in town from time to time. But I don't think the woman's ever been the same since that grievous accident. I guess it gets quite lonely living in the big ranch-style house she lives in now. But her daughter Sylvia lives with her by all accounts. And they're very close, you know. Sylvia never married, you see. I'm not sure why. I've always found her rather aloof and unapproachable." "What a story," I said, looking aghast. Oh dear, said Mrs. Erickson, straightening her sun hat. I probably shouldn't have told you about the accident, my dear. It happened a long time ago, before you were even born. I don't mean to upset you, but I thought it was wise to tell you what occurred, in case you hear it from somewhere else. You've moved into such a beautiful location, so don't let an unsettling story like this displace you. I smiled warmly at Mrs. Erickson. Don't feel bad, I said. I'm glad you told me. It's tragic, though, but I won't let that put me off this house. It is tragic. I do feel dreadfully sorry for Mrs. Thornton, as I was saying. I can't imagine how the poor woman must have felt. She had her hands full with those kids, you know. Was absolutely exhausted, she was. I don't know how it would feel to be a parent and accidentally run over your own child. People sometimes do it with their pets, and it's hard to forgive yourself for that. But when it's your own child, it's a very different story. Mr. Thornton was a wonderful man, you know, so loyal and devoted to his wife. He was devastated to lose little Jackie, but he rigidly stood by his wife, never blaming her once for the accident. People around here respected him for that, you know. A very good man. And it was a nice family, too. But after Jackie was born, that little girl was one big bundle of energy. And I do remember Mrs. Thornton describing her as very hyperactive. I had that girl over to play one afternoon. Well, my mother did, let's just say, and I helped out. I was shattered, let me tell you. That girl was hard work. Jackie never settled down. She wasn't easy for the poor Thorntons. They found her a handful. Even my own mother said that she was very glad I didn't behave like her when I was little. Anyway, let me get back to my vegetables. They won't water themselves. You're so welcome to drop around to my house any time you like, my dear. I talk about old Mrs. Thornton rattling around in her big house with her daughter Sylvia, but I'm doing much the same myself, so I always appreciate good company. One of my children lives in Montreal in Canada. The other is living in Albuquerque, New Mexico, so I don't get to see them terribly often. But I've got my 3 cats, and they keep me busy all the time. But a friendly new neighbour popping around for tea will be gladly welcome, so come over whenever you like. I'd love to see you. Thank you very much, Mrs. Erickson. I'll take you up on your offer. 2 nights later, I'm lying asleep, blissfully in my bed, caught up in the muddy mire of my dreams that I won't remember in the morning. Donnie is lying at my side. It's a mild night, with relatively warm temperatures. In my dream, the door of my closet creaks wide open, and a pair of little footsteps quietly pad over to my bed. And then I see her again, the little girl with the blood-soaked white dress, the girl called Jackie, the girl I'd last seen at 16 years old, and I thought I'd sent away back to the light, the girl whom had also bothered my brother. She's now standing there at the end of my bed. Help me! Help me! You have to help me! I'm Jackie Thornton! My husband is slapping my face and crying out to me, Molly! Molly, wake up! You're having a nightmare! Molly! Molly! It was just a dream, love. You're all right. I look at my husband through bleary eyes, in abject bewilderment. I sit up sharply, wiping the debris of sleep away from my eyes. My heart is booming away in my chest like a drum. Sweat is breaking out on my top lip. I'm not sure it was a dream, Donnie, I say. The girl that appeared to me in the blood-soaked white nightdress when I was 16 years old is back again. She's haunting me, Donnie. I'm not joking. The pieces to this puzzle are beginning to fit. I think she lived in this house in the late 1960s. She was run over by her mother in the driveway. She wants me to help her. How can I possibly help her, Donnie? How can I possibly help a ghost child? Have you ever heard anything so ridiculous in your entire life? When have the dead needed anything from the living? My husband's face tightened. He looked befuddled. It was a nightmare, sweetheart. Don't read too much into it. What do you mean a little girl living here was run over by her mother in the driveway? What on earth are you talking about? It's true, I told Donnie. Mrs. Erickson, who lives next door. She told me the entire story. She was living next door when it happened. She was young at the time. She said that in 1973, a 7-year-old girl called Jackie Thornton was run down in the driveway by her own mother. The family was completely devastated. They moved away. They sold our house to the couple we bought the place from. Mr. Thornton died a while back from emphysema, and his other 2 kids left home, according to Mrs. Erickson. But now she lives not too far away from here with her daughter Sylvia, who's never been married. Well, sweetheart, said Donnie, if it's a ghost child asking you for help, it's a little too late for that now, is it not? I mean, the girl is dead. I think you must tell her to leave you alone, and that you can't possibly help her. 1 week later, the girl in the blood-soaked dress appeared to me on 2 more occasions, even though I told her to go away and to leave me alone. She was as tenacious as the grass that bounds back after a cruel winter, pushing its way through the earth, determined to be noticed. I knew this little girl wasn't going away in a hurry. Even in death I could sense her resolute determination. She wanted help from me, but how could I give it to her? It was later that day when I steadfastly began to clean out the closet in my bedroom, removing the old wallpaper that had been on the walls since the 70s. I shredded the paper and saw some child's scrawly writing in red crayon. Were the words, "It was no accident." My blood went cold. Is that what Jackie was trying to tell me? Was her death not an accident? Did her mother deliberately run her over in the driveway of her home? Surely not. I glanced down at my cell phone, and the time on my caller ID was 2:32, and a chill ran down my spine. Wow, so there we are. That's the end of part 3 of our story. Isn't this very exciting? I wonder where it's leading us. So until next time, goodbye and good night. I look forward to you joining me tomorrow night.